Hey everyone out there in YouTube land, I'm Roy Carter from YouTube Media, and today I'd like to start a video series on how science and the medical industry is being completely manipulated by the powers that be in favor of monetary and political gains. This series is meant to shed light on the dishonesty and indoctrination that is purposely being implanted into the public and future scientists that plan to head out in their own respective fields. I'm not a scientist myself, obviously, but I feel I have to make these videos to show the sides of the argument that are often ignored and suppressed by the media and the UN-led institutions that use dogma instead of the scientific method as the law of the land. So let's start off with the climate change issue. We are told that there's a 97% consensus among climatologists that agree that anthropogenic or man-made climate change is causing a rise in global temperatures. You've probably seen this figure spewed out by politicians, celebrities, and even supposed scientific establishments alike. The actual basis of this claim is from a small sampling of surveys and the emission of dissenting viewpoints. A frequently cited source is a 2004 opinion essay published in Science magazine by Naomi Oreskes, a science historian at Harvard. She claimed to have checked out 928 articles published in scientific journals between 1993 and 2003, and claimed that 75% supported that human activities were responsible for most of the observed warming over the previous 50 years, and that there was absolutely no dissent in these findings. Ms. Oreskes' definition of consensus covered man-made, but omitted scores of articles by prominent scientists like Professor Richard Lindzen, John Christie, Sherwood Edzo, Tim Ball, Patrick Michaels, whose findings didn't relate to her own narrative. Her methodology was also noted to be a bit flawed when a study published during 2014 in Nature, an online publication, noted that abstracts of academic papers often contained claims that were not substantiated in the papers themselves. Another widely cited source for the consensus view was a 2009 article in EOS Transactions, American Geophysical Union, by Maggie Kendall Zimmerman, a student at the University of Illinois, and her master's thesis advisor Peter Doran. It reported the result of a two-question online survey of selected scientists. Mr. Doran and Ms. Zimmerman claimed that 97% of the climate scientists agree that global temperatures have risen and that humans are a significant contributing factor. The survey's questions didn't reveal much of interest. Most scientists who are skeptical of catastrophic global warming nevertheless would answer yes to both questions. The survey was silent on whether the human impact is large enough to constitute a problem, nor did it include solar scientists, space scientists, cosmologists, physicists, meteorologists, or astronomers, who are the scientists most likely to be aware of natural causes of climate change. The 97% figure in the Zimmerman-Doran survey represents the views of only 79 respondents, who listed climate science as an area of expertise, and said they published more than half of their recent peer-reviewed papers on climate change. Only 79 scientists out of the 3,146 scientists who were given the survey even responded, which right there destroys the 97% narrative. The Wall Street Journal does a great job exposing others like William R. Love Anderegg and John Cook that completely cherry-picked and manipulated data for their own agenda. Mr. Cook was even quickly debunked in Science and Education, and there are also many studies that debunk the 97% narrative. All you have to do is search for yourself to see that one of the main talking points of those who support the anthropogenic climate change is deeply contested. PetitionProject.org and others like the OISM have had findings that directly contest the 97% narrative as well. I think it's disgusting to see the 97% echo chamber being championed, while any attempt to investigate those claims are met with accusations of being controlled by the big oil and gas lobby, when trillions have been spent in taxpayers' money to push the alarmist agendas. Now let's move on to another alarmist talking point, the polar bear population. Being a Canadian, I have a vested interest in these noble yet ferocious creatures, and I would never want to see them become extinct in any way. The polar bear population has increased significantly during the 1950s and 1960s. To think that polar bears are unable to survive any recent changes is ridiculous, as they've already survived at least one interglacial period, as proposed by Dr. Olafur Ingolfsson, a professor from the University of Iceland. I've looked at other sides' argument on this, and they claim that it has to do with the reduction and elimination of hunting quotas in Arctic countries, and the fact that it wasn't really properly reported beforehand in the 60s, but there is no doubt that the polar bear populations are healthy, if not increasing today. Another talking point proposed by Al Gore is that all Arctic sea ice will be gone by 2013. This claim, of course, has been proved false, and in the past couple of years have shown that Arctic sea ice during the summer up until this year in 2016 to El Nino was actually pretty high. This gave such amusing stories as last year's story of a global warming research expedition that got trapped in the ice. And there are reports all over North America of record cold weather events from Buffalo to Florida and even in Romania. Now, to be fair, weather and the climate are not the same thing, as much as the mainstream media and the establishment would have you believe. Yet I can't help but see the idiocracy of logic when practically every extreme weather event is used as proof that climate change is a clear and present danger, when it really could be used by both sides of the argument to establish whatever claim they desire. In the 1970s, the alarmism in climate science was focused on the possibility of a potential re-emergence of a new ice age. A great show that explored all variation of ideas of the scientific, environmental, and metaphysical possibilities was hosted by the late great Leonard Nimoy. The In Search Of did a show on how ice core samples and the data of that day pointed to the potential of the Earth turning back into a snow globe. This was before the IPCC, Thatcher, and other globalist entities and organizations had manipulated data to support a political agenda. And I highly recommend people watching this to check it out, as the link will be put as footnote 10 in the description below. Now, before I get into the data aspect of why I think anthropogenic warming has been blown completely out of proportion, I think we should also focus on credibility. While it's easy for the mainstream to criticize institutions like Heartland and other entities that oppose their manufactured consensus, I find it very sickening that organizations like the IPCC, NOAA, NASA, and other organizations have completely omitted, edited, and even falsified data to fit their own narrative. Yet those who champion the anthropogenic cause often cite these institutions with a sort of loyalty and fervor that rivals the darkest elements and chapters of human obedience in history. The ClimateGate emails are more than ample evidence of outright manipulation. Coined by James Dellingpool, it refers to the mass emails that were hacked and released to the public from the University of East Anglia's Climatic Research Unit. I highly recommend people to look into it themselves, but it involves some of the most prestigious scientists who have been the main drivers of the push for carbon credit taxation and cap-and-trade schemes with the UN. They brazenly talk about hiding the decline and editing empirical data to suit their own agenda by eliminating the medieval warm period altogether, while editing the Minoan and Roman warm periods to seem like they weren't as warm as today's temperatures. This was also called the worst scientific scandal of our generation by The Telegraph. And again, I highly recommend people read that article, as it shows the collusion between a handful of scientists working with the UN agenda for global taxation. A link to the emails, done in the order the emails were sent, has been posted on climateaudit.org. And I also recommend highly that you read them for yourself to see how just erroneously the facts were edited for political gain. I've gone on to other sites trying to debunk the ClimateGate emails, but all they do is deny any wrongdoing and defend the emails as being taken out of context, which is complete and outright bullshit. For a website like Skeptical Science, who does its absolute to discredit deniers, they do a wonderful job at denying reality and insulting anyone's intelligence who has actually taken the time to read the ClimateGate emails themselves. Let's not forget, about 2 years later, almost to the day, another 5,000 emails were hacked and released, which was dubbed ClimateGate 2.0. The most damning of the emails were, and I'll be reading some of these out, "I've been told that the IPCC is above natural Freedom of Information Acts. One way to cover yourself and all those working in AR5 would be to delete all emails at the end of the process," writes Phil Jones, a scientist working with the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Here's another. Any work we have done in the past is done on the back of the research grants we get, and it has to be well hidden, Jones writes in another newly released email. Here's another one. I've discussed this with the main funder, U.S. Department of Energy, brackets, in the past, and they are happy about not releasing the original station data. The trick may be to decide on the main message, and you use that to guide what's included and what's left out of IPCC reports, writes Jonathan Overpeck, coordinating lead author for the IPCC's most recent climate assessment. Here's another one. I gave up on, brackets, Georgia Institute of Technology climate professor Judith Curry a while ago. I don't know what she thinks she's doing, but it's not helping the cause, wrote Michael Mann in another released email. Here we go. I have been talking with folks in the States about finding an investigative journalist to investigate and expose skeptical science, Steve McIntyre, Mann writes in another newly released email. These new emails add weight to ClimateGate 1.0 emails, revealing efforts to politicize the scientific debate. For example, Tom Wigley, a scientist at the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, authored a ClimateGate 1.0 email asserting that his fellow ClimateGate scientist must get rid of the editor for a peer-reviewed science journal, all because he published some papers contradicting assertions of a global warming crisis. And I quote, observations do not show rising temperatures throughout the tropical troposphere unless you accept one single study and approach and discount a wealth of others. This is just downright dangerous. We need to communicate the uncertainty and be honest, Phil. Hopefully we can find time to discuss these further if necessary. Writes Peter Thorne of the UK Met Office. Sorry, I'm doing this goofy accent. Here we go. I also think the science is being manipulated to put a political spin on it, which, for all our sakes, might not be too clever in the long run. Thorne adds. Oh, at least that guy wasn't completely corrupt. Here we go. Mike, the figure you sent is very deceptive. There have been a number of dishonest presentations of model results by individual authors and by the IPCC. Wigley acknowledges. Does this still seem like quotes being taken out of context and completely scientifically objective to you? It sure as hell doesn't seem so to me. However, I recommend anyone watching this video to do their own research. What we have here in these emails is clear evidence of science being manipulated to suit a cause. Michael Mann and his hockey stick and fake tree ring cronies are controlling the scientific narrative for the entire world. Why haven't they all been completely discredited and fired for going against the very principles of science? Simple. There's money in fear-based taxation and carbon market derivatives that control entire energy companies and the public, which is just one of the many aspects of achieving an Orwellian global governance. This isn't rhetoric, folks. It's easy to see a few cases of manipulation here and there in our society and take it as coincidence, but when you look at the big picture, you can clearly see a push towards consolidation, eradication of national sovereignty, citizens' rights, the elimination of private property ownership by the public, and the restrictions of all of our personal freedoms, whether it be speech, religion, right to assemble, and dissent. Now, I understand it's easy to criticize someone for not believing in the alarmism, for not going with the flow of trendy globalists who have designed a system where they want you to love being a peasant class like with communism, but there are some very disturbing cheerleaders out there, like Bill Nye, a man I idolized and respected growing up as a kid with his educational TV show, who is openly calling for throwing anyone who opposes the IPCC's narrative in jail. I am deeply saddened to see that history is once again about to repeat itself. Galileo and many other visionaries of their time had their lives completely destroyed by the prevailing scientific consensus of their time. When Einstein challenged the very foundation of Newtonian physics, there was a huge push by about 100 of the most prominent scientists of the day to do everything they could to discredit his theories. Since when has the science ever been settled 100%, when our own observable universe only counts for a very small percentage of all the matter contained? Hell, possibly even in a multiverse or omniverse. I believe all theories should be examined using the scientific method, yet when you add greed and corruption to almost any concept, it becomes disingenuous and fails, or falls prey to tyranny. Now let's look at the UN's global solution to reducing carbon dioxide, after having agencies around the world declaring it a toxin despite it being plant food. Now let's look at the three main solutions to combat the supposed carbon menace. 1. Carbon credits. A permit that allows a country or organization to produce a certain amount of carbon emissions that can be traded if the full allowance is not used. Number 2. Cap and trade. The cap sets a limit on emissions which is lowered over time to reduce the amount of pollutants released into the atmosphere. And 3. Carbon capture and storage is the process of capturing waste carbon dioxide from large point sources, such as fossil fuel power plants, transporting it to a storage site, and depositing it where it will not enter the atmosphere normally, underground. When you look at the definition of these terms, it doesn't seem so bad to myself, and I assume to the rest of the public. Yet, how do you make a global market out of taxing and subsidizing carbon, methane, and other UN-declared pollutants? Offsets, of course, which are used as an economic tool for people and industries to buy and sell on Wall Street. Because when you add greed to their equation, profitability becomes the main focus instead of the environment. Breitbart did a great job exposing how carbon credits were made up by Ken Lay from Enron and Al Gore and his acolytes to create a derivatives market for carbon trading. Here's how the scam began and progressed into the screwjob it is today. Al Gore took office in '93 and almost immediately became infatuated with the idea of an international environmental regulatory regime. He led a U.S. initiative to review new projects around the world and issue credits of so many tons of annual carbon dioxide emission reduction. Under a law, a tradable system was required, which was exactly what Enron also wanted because they were already trading pollutant credits. Thence, Enron vigorously lobbied Clinton in Congress, seeking EPA regulatory authority over carbon dioxide, and also the support of other key figures of the Green Blob, such as the all-powerful environmental NGOs. From 1994 to 1996, the Enron Foundation contributed nearly $1 million to the Nature Conservancy, whose climate change project promotes global warming theories. Enron philanthropists lavished almost $1.5 on environmental groups that supported international energy controls to reduce global warming. Executives at Enron worked closely with the Clinton administration to help create a scaremongering climate science environment because the company believed the treaty could provide it with a monstrous financial windfall. Everyone involved in the Green Circle jerk stood and stands to benefit from the scam. Those included privileged countries like India and China, the largest and easily the most lucrative component of the CDM market. Administered under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, is a peculiar racket centered on the manufacture of chlorofluorocarbons, classified under Kyoto as greenhouse gases infinitely more potent than carbon dioxide. The way the racket works is that Chinese and Indian firms are permitted to carry on production of the refrigerant gas known as HCFC-22 until 2030. But a byproduct of this process is HCFC-23, which is 11,700 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. The firms can then destroy the HCFC-23, claiming allocations of carbon credits worth billions for doing so. It's so ridiculous. The shady one world government freak and communist sympathizers who devised the Rio Earth Summit. Thus, we pay billions of dollars to the Asian countries for the right to continue emitting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases here in the West. including the £60 million contributed by British taxpayers to keep their civil servants warm. As a result, we enrich a small number of people in China and India, including the late Maurice Strong, who was living in exile in Beijing. He was caught in the 2005 illicitly receiving $1 million from Saddam Hussein in the oil for food scandal. He played a key part in setting up China's carbon exchange to buy and sell the CDM credits administered by the UNFCCC, of which Strong himself was the chief architect. Green gangster NGOs like the World Wildlife Foundation, which stood to make millions from the carbon protection racket. If it then emerged, however, that a hidden agenda of the scheme to preserve this chunk of the forest was to allow the World Wildlife Foundation and its partners to share the selling of carbon credits worth $60 billion to enable firms in the industrial world to carry on emitting carbon dioxide just as before, more than a few eyebrows might be raised. The idea is that credits representing the carbon dioxide locked into this particular area of jungle, so remote that it is not under any threat, should be sold on the international market, allowing thousands of companies in the developed world to buy their way out of having to restrict their carbon emissions. The net effect would simply be to make the World Wildlife Foundation and its partners much richer while making absolutely no contribution to lowering the overall carbon dioxide emissions. What a racket this is. In 2011, the global carbon trading market was worth $176 billion, which, as Joe Nova noted, was the same value as total global wheat production. One industry supplies about 20% of the total calories consumed by the 7 billion people on the planet. The other pays for Al Gore's waterside homes, private jet travel, and intimate massages. Putin has came out and declared global warming a fraud despite Russia's past involvement, and they took quite advantage of the selling the carbon offsets on the global market. That being said, let's move on to data and leave policy-based criticism for later. For those scientists out there who are a glutton for data and graphs that go into great detail, I recommend you read Evidence-Based Climate Science by Dr. Easterbrook. He also does a great job on YouTube for those on a budget or have a lot of free time. I'll cite other scientists later, but let's focus on the fear-mongering of the 1990s into the 2000s, when the IPCC and other global entities had us all convinced that the world was going to boil over and melt all of the polar ice. Well, let's look at the IPCC's climate models compared to the actual rise in global temperatures, and you can start to see how full of crap the IPCC is. Another absolutely obvious display of rewriting history is the discrepancies between the 1990 IPCC report to reports afterwards. Notice the medieval warm period and Little Ice Age's sudden disappearance? Let's not forget the deliberate deletion of temperature data during the 1930s that shows it was the hottest decade in the 1900s. Yet NOAA's data tells a completely different story, of course, making people believe that 1999 was the hottest year on record, which was a bold-faced lie. In fact, when you look at how much data that has existed previously for years, and which have been altered from the 1990 to 2010 period, you really begin to get a clear picture of the academic dishonesty. Here's the 1975 National Academy of Sciences graph, showing a 1 degree Celsius warming in the Northern Hemisphere from 1885 to 1940, and that all 1900 to 1940 warming was lost by 1970. Now let's take a look at GISS's graph, and you see quite the difference. It's only when you compare the two overlap that you can see the outright exaggeration. Stephen Goddard also goes to the effort to show newspaper clips from the Daily Mercury back in April 1933, where people were actually afraid the Arctic would disappear completely, compared to the 1970s New York Times article where they predicted a colder Arctic. What about the Antarctic? Well, even NASA's had to come out and admit that the Antarctic sheet has reached a new record maximum. After all those years of alarmist claims of the Western Arm being a catalyst for excessive melting and a worldwide Waterworld scenario, I'm looking at you, bullshit Earth Underwater documentary. In fact, there's actually been a fair number of both warm and cool periods since the 1480s. Now, in Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, there is a part where he tries to match up the two readings of both carbon dioxide and temperature to imply that carbon dioxide caused the temperature to rise. This is deliberately misleading. In fact, there's usually an 800-year lag in the carbon dioxide after temperature, which became abundantly clear in 2003. Now, this part is contested by both sides of the climate change argument, with the skeptics citing that temperature is most likely the cause of heightened CO2 levels, while the anthropogenic believers claim that radiative forcing due to carbon dioxide may serve as an amplifier of initial orbital forcing, which is then further amplified by fast atmospheric feedbacks that are also at work from the present day and future climate. Whatever that means. Just joking. Alternative theories range from cosmic rays to volcanic activity. There has also been a cooling trend for U.S. winters, temperatures from anywhere from 1.3 to 8.7 degrees Fahrenheit, as shown by NOAA from 2001/02 and from the 2010-2011. It should also be noticed that there is also a push towards regulating cow and sheep farts. I'm not joking, folks. And there are even international pharmaceutical pushes to create fart-stopping vaccines. That's too bad they didn't have that for the dinosaurs. Now, what gets me about the both sides of this issue is the outright name-calling. Yes, I've been guilty of it in this video by referring to those in favor of anthropogenic warming, cooling change, or whatever they wanted to decide that day. And yes, I admit both sides just want the truth, and, they both care about the future. I completely understand that premise, yet calling those skeptical of anthropogenic warming being the sole cause of warming climate deniers is a far worse comparison. For one, it has the resemblance of a Holocaust denier, which is completely unfair. In fact, most of the anti-anthropogenic warming as the main factor openly admit that the climate does, in fact, change quite often. There's practically no climatologist that believes the Earth permanently stays at one temperature forever. Yet when you look at both camps, the deniers are usually the ones pushing for stopping the corruption of data and for more non-UN approved independent studies to be done. Deniers attend international events right alongside the alarmists and have never outright asked for the alarmists to be thrown in jail for their opinions. Yet when I look at the alarmist camp, I see authoritarians who want nothing more than the suppression of information, the elimination of dissenting opinions, and the ostracization, and even in some cases outright firing or removal of deniers' employment at universities and other educational facilities around the world. There are a lot more cases of climatologists getting fired without any reason whatsoever, like Nicholas Drapella, a professor who worked at Oregon State University, than those who toe the anthropogenic cause. Oh look, here's another example of a Professor Caleb Rossiter, who was fired after a Wall Street Journal op-ed, critical of the leftist eco-warriors narrative. Here's what they said. We would like to inform you that we are terminating your position as an Associate Fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies. Unfortunately, we now feel that your views on key issues, including climate science, climate justice, and many aspects of U.S. policy to Africa, diverge so significantly from ours. Here we have a taxpayer-subsidized and funded educational institution outright admitting their bias. Climate justice? What is this, Batman? It could be like climate justice with a giant C on his chest like Superman? You've got to be freaking kidding me. I'm sick of seeing educational institutions get turned into cultural Marxist hellholes for political agendas. Whatever happened to having an open and intellectual liberal campus with a diversity of opinions? It seems like educational institutions all around the world are being turned into Orwellian thought police institutions. I've seen a lot of channels on YouTube and websites in general addressing the insanity of coddled social justice warrior mentality, yet I find it hard to find those same people defend climatologists who resist becoming brainwashed by a cult mentality. I guess it's not trendy enough, and their ideas aren't liked enough for them to want to, say that they still have the right to say it. Climate scientist Dr. Leonard Benson, who converted from warmist to skeptic, had to resign after enormous group pressure from warmists. An environmental physicist and statistical analyst, Dr. Jean-Louis Pinault, his book is The Melody of the Oceans to Climate Change, A Fight Against Ostracism. He says, arguing natural climate variability observed in the past, including the recent past regarding the Little Ice Age, they refute alarmist predictions that are becoming harder to sustain as the temperature of the planet has no longer increased over the last 15 years significantly, while the concentration of carbon dioxide is soaring. The confrontation between the proponents of global warming due to human activity, supported by the IPCC, and skeptics reflects a misunderstanding of the mechanisms involved in climate variability. Computers of the former allow a bad model to be accurately wrong. I quote William Gray, whereas the latter challenge the working methods and the scientific integrity of the IPCC members who cling tenaciously to the theory of greenhouse gases liable for global warming, which is the raison d'etre of the IPCC. But this very uneven debate, skeptics cannot enforce their arguments in scientific journals that are subject to censorship since the Copenhagen Climate Conference, and that is an end quote. There are so many examples of prominent scientists being ostracized, like in the case of Dr. David Gear, a geoscientist and former UN consultant from New Zealand, who had the audacity of defending carbon dioxide when it was globally declared a harmful toxin. The sad thing is, there are numerous cases out there of predominant scientists being fired or ostracized despite the global warming narrative failing and having to be rebranded as climate change. Anything could change in the climate, and they will declare it as climate change. The sad thing is that it's usually targeted towards older scientists, as younger scientists have either been completely brainwashed by the system into the establishment's mindset or are completely afraid to have their careers completely destroyed and everything they've worked for by a globalist-led agenda or by their peers. Another alarmist talking point is that global warming was supposed to cause more hurricanes and extreme weather events. Yet this is not the case. In fact, from two spikes in 1974 and 2009, EF1 or greater tornadoes have stayed the same, with low spikes in the late 80s, early 90s, and 2010. Strong tornadoes, F3s or plus, in the U.S. from 1954 to 2014 have also been down considerably. There's also been a record drought of major hurricanes, categories 3 and up, recently, which can be clearly seen from 1900 to 2013. The alarmists can try to debunk skeptics as much as they want, but they can't debunk the unpredictability of nature. When the data is not completely altered, there are many aspects of the anthropogenic warming or change that even the most fervent supporters have had to admit. Whether it's the pause, the reduction in extreme weather events, the polar vortexes that have caused record snowfalls in North America and even in Romania and Egypt, other locations that usually really don't receive that kind of weather, their narrative has been completely destroyed by their own vanity, as with the released ClimateGate emails. They're bullying of intellectual scientists who have been around for decades, and they've all put up with the constant past 50 years of ever-changing climate alarmism, from a new ice age in the 70s to warming during the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, to pretty much just any change whatsoever. It should also be noted that Al Gore's mentor, James Lovelock, has admitted that he was alarmist and extrapolated too far and admitted that Gore has done the same. This is the guy who wrote the Gaia Hypothesis series that suggests that the Earth is a living organism, and at one point believed that we'd be living in times of Armageddon-like catastrophe. Yet I've watched his recent video interviews, and I can't help but have respect for him. It takes a lot of courage to change your mind when your whole career has been made from a following a set principle. Of course, his past disciples have completely abandoned him, and he has no obvious love for the green agenda anymore. At the age of 97, he's shown us all that the scientific method is a harsh judge, Your theory either works out or it doesn't. Just like so many of his predecessors, he spent his life in the pursuit of empirical and unadulterated data, in the grand pursuit of knowledge. When he does leave this mortal coil, he will be one of a dying breed of intellectual, where scientific accomplishment comes not from oppression and the control of ideas and data, but from the constant trial and error that has gotten us to where we are today. If those were in favor of anthropogenic warming were more like him, we could actually begin to have real progress and a real discussion towards being proper stewards of the planet, free from the constraints of political chains and cult mentality. In conclusion, the progress of humanity relies on you, the viewer. It's up to you to do your own research and make up your own damn mind. Hell, I may be wrong about warming or cooling. Like I said, I'm not a scientist, yet I have enough life experience to know when someone is lying, and I have no problem looking at both sides of an issue and judging them on the faults and merits of their arguments. I believe that everyone should have their own theories and be proven by time and the nature of the universe. Yet, we must always be vigilant of editing the past and doctoring data. That is the worst crime against the future development of the human race. The global push for the regulation, taxation, and control of all aspects of human activity is a very slippery slope into tyranny. I would never want to lock someone up for their scientific analysis, and any decent human being should be against that as well. Just look at the many historical examples of scientists who held different opinions in their day. Yes, Edison is remembered today, but Tesla's inventions, from the AC motor to the invention of the radio, wireless transmissions, etc., have helped shape the future we live in today. Anyways, I'm going to leave a few YouTube links on the numerous footnotes in the description below for anyone who's interested. Thank you very much for your time, and take care, folks. Peace.